What's up, guys? Today we're going to be breaking down the Necromancer class in the Convergence mod for Elden Ring. Let's get to it. Okay, the Necromancer is a sorcerer class that uses Int and Faith for scaling and uses holy damage as its primary damage type. That's only true in the mod. In vanilla, it uses other damage types. It actually uses two different status effects. One is Deathblight, which now has a universal effect on all enemies in the mod, and also Frostbite. So the Ghost Flame spells will build Frostbite, and then the other more death-oriented spells will build Deathblight. So the new effect of Deathblight in the mod is that when it procs, it'll actually make the enemy less resistant to other status effects by like 50%, and it'll make them 20% weaker to damage of all types while it's active. And it's active for about 30 seconds after a proc. So universally, it's very good in the mod, whereas in base game, it only affects tarnished enemies. So obviously, as a Necromancer, their themes are necromancy and undead, manipulating undead, and using death-themed spells. But this is the first breakdown that we've done of one of the summoner classes. So one of the features of Convergence is that it uses a sort of new take on the way that spirit summoning works. Basically, if you use spirit summoning, first of all, you can use it anywhere in the world for the most part. You can resummon after summons go away. You're not locked out of it for any particular time, and you can just kind of reuse them over and over. So to sort of offset that big boost that we've given to summons, we have made it so that when you summon a particular spirit, that it will lower your total HP, FP, and stamina total down by a certain amount, depending on how powerful that particular summon is. So we have grouped all the summons by certain tiers, and then they will, the weaker tiers will only lower it by a little bit, whereas the big tiers will lower it by a lot. So just to kind of show that, if I summon this Mausoleum Soldier, you can see that my total HP, all three of my stats have dropped. But then when I unsummon them, they all come back. So the summoner classes are special because they get access to certain spells that prevent this debuff from happening. The other spellcaster classes, while they could use these spells, they don't get them as part of their toolkit, essentially. So it essentially gives them a way to play with summons in the way that you would in vanilla, thereby making them more pure summoner classes. And then they also have spells which are designed to affect summon-based playstyles, or at least augment summon-based playstyles. And of course, that's just an option. You certainly don't have to use summons if you're being a Necromancer, but it is sort of a major theme of the class. Overall, I would say that in terms of strengths and weaknesses, the amount of damage that Necromancer is capable of doing just with its spells alone are not the highest. And in fact, up until recently, they were probably the absolute lowest in terms of raw damage output, or at least one, like, toward the absolute bottom. And part of the reason for that is that summon-based playstyles tend to be a little easier on the player. It has always been my opinion that summoning has always been sort of like the way in which From Software has implemented difficulty options into their games. They don't have a bar or a slider or selector in their UI for difficulty. They like to build them in through mechanics, and summoning is definitely one of the ways they could do that. It seems more true in Elden Ring than maybe some other previous titles. But we kind of wanted to take the system and leverage it a little bit differently for the purposes of the mod, because we felt that summoning could be a really fun thing for people to do sort of universally. So we put a fair amount of work into it. In terms of strengths, I say if you're playing with summons and using them, like using them properly and buffing them and helping them and then letting them potentially take aggro and all these things, they don't exactly have very many weaknesses if you're going that route. Whereas if you're going without summons, then they have some pretty cool mechanics, and they have a lot of really cool sort of... like, Necromancers have, I would say, a highly nuanced playstyle, because they have a lot of unique effects that are only part of the Necromancer toolkit. And we'll get into that when we start talking about the spells. But yeah, so for this class, obviously the three primary playstyles are still present. You can be pure caster, you can be hybrid melee and caster, and of course you could be pure melee. But they kind of have this extra layer, which is the summon thing, right? You could add a summon to any of those three types, and you have like kind of a whole new sort of game experience with that. And so that extra layer of complexity definitely makes the class one of the more interesting ones. Okay, let's start with the spells. So the opening three spells you're going to get are Fia's Mist, Tibia's Summons, and Blighted Armament. Blighted Armament is kind of your typical weapon buff. but what it'll do is it'll actually make the weapon that you coat with blight build death blight on the thing you're hitting. So it's supplemental weapon buff, dealing extra damage, but also building up that status effect. So in terms of, it is actually possible for at least one other class with their spells to build death blight. They're not the only class that can do it, but they are the class that does it the best. Now their sort of secondary status effect, which is frostbite, they do not build that the best. They have decent frostbite building, but it's not fantastic because it's not like their strongest theme, you might say. So Fia's Mist was, we've changed it so that instead of just being something that builds death blight like it is in vanilla, it now builds death blight and deals damage. And we've actually recently buffed the damage on this spell so that it actually is decent. So you can see there that like the damage he's taking is not insignificant, and this damage does scale. And there the death blight has procced, which we have a new visual for it, and now creates the flies and the branches coming out of the guy. And overall, the spell is just your typical sort of mist style spell. It creates an area of effect, continuously deals damage, and it's certainly not bad. Like I pointed out before, they're not really meant to be the highest sort of DPS class, but they're not really the worst anymore, I would say. Okay, up next we have Tibia's Summons. Tibia's Summons is... I have my own sort of misgivings about this spell. And the big problem with it is that the visual effect, the FXR on the spell is, it's built to specification for this spell only. And we can't, as modders, easily edit it. So basically, everyone kind of knows Tibia's Summons is a really difficult spell to use, right? Mostly because of the delay between when the skeletons appear and when their sort of strikes hit something. So I'm going to actually get a little bit technical to explain the challenges with this spell. So what we did to it first was we increased the damage and changed the casting animation so that the casting animation's a lot faster and spammable, thinking that this would improve its utility, maybe make it somewhat more useful. Overall, we weren't 100% correct in thinking that that would make it more useful. The issue with the spell is that the visual that you see of the three skeletons actually has nothing to do with the way in which the spell hits you. It's an illusion. What's really going on is that the character is actually shooting out invisible bullets into the world, and then those bullets are timed to synchronize with the chops of the skeletons. So to tamper with those bullets would be to irrevocably break the spell's functionality. We also cannot edit or adjust the speed of the three skeletons attacking without breaking the visual effect. So it's a spell that is basically impossible for us to edit. So we were faced with a choice of either leave it the way it is and increase the damage, or scrap it entirely. And so we decided to go ahead and leave it, just because it's a cool spell visually. Now, in terms of practical usage, it's woefully inadequate. Like, you cast it on anything, and if that thing moves even an inch, it misses. So there's a couple of solutions that we've kind of been working on as potential ways to quote-unquote fix the spell, or at least expand its utility. But all of them are kind of, for lack of a better word, jank. And so the spell kind of is what it is for now, but that doesn't mean it might not change in the future. It definitely could. But interestingly, you know, with our buffs, the damage on it is great, assuming the thing you're hitting is standing perfectly still. So there's still a niche for it. It still has use. It's just an awkward spell, to say the least. All right, up next, we have Rancor Call. So this is one of the Necromancer's most basic projectile spells, and it shoots out. It's just like the vanilla version, but its damage has been increased, and it now builds Frostbite, unlike in vanilla where it did not. So the uncharged version, you can see, still does decent damage. One of the biggest drawbacks to spells like the Rancor style spells is that they tend to not travel very fast. And so it definitely provides like this sort of window for enemies to attack you. And once again, they're not that great at incredibly close range. And also the casting speed is not the fastest either. So bear in mind that spells like this, when I am conceptualizing a spell like this, I'm not just conceptualizing it in a vacuum, like how good is this to spam and kill enemies. I'm considering that the player may or may not have summons out when they're doing it. And so if you have summons out there tanking, then Rancor Call becomes a lot more effective. You're able to stay at a distance, you're able to deliver the damage, and you're able to hit them with all those projectiles. And if you are able to hit something with all the projectiles, then the damage is great. Also, the damage to mana ratio is really good on Ranker Call, so another sort of vote for it in that direction. Up next, we have Lingering Blight. Okay, here it is. So it shoots out a projectile, does a tiny bit of damage when it first hits something, but all that it does is build up Deathblight. Builds up Deathblight on the thing that it's attached to. As you can see, Deathblight is built up. This is a spell that the reason why it does a little bit of damage when it hits stuff is just to pull aggro, because we didn't want very many spells that are sort of debuffs or curses to have the enemy not be aware that it's happening and therefore not attack you. So letting you sort of prime your targets a little bit more cheesy fashion. Basically, we wanted to avoid that. Now, I do think for Lingering Blight that might be a bit punitive, because it doesn't actually deal damage, it just builds up Deathblight, but I think overall, as a general design philosophy, having enemies aggro when you hit them with the spell is probably fine. Especially if you consider the power of Deathblight given its new criteria, making them take 20% extra damage as long as it's active, and also their status effect buildup, they're weaker to status effects. It's really, really strong. It's actually one of the reasons why we decided to implement the Frostbite buildup on Ranker spells, is we wanted to give them a way to build another status after something is Deathblighted. Otherwise, sort of half the benefit of their Deathblight is lost because they're not building any other statuses other than Deathblight. So that's why we wanted to make sure they had that secondary status theme. So you could potentially Lingering Blight something and then hit them with Ranker-style spells, and which will then proc a little bit easier. There's the Frostbite proc. And so as soon as his Deathblight was procced, he got frostbitten and took a bunch of extra damage. So it really does give you the sort of DPS power you might be looking for in this class. Something you shouldn't sleep on if you're playing Necromancer, especially if you're not going the summon route. Up next, we have Rally the Legion. So this is a buff to your summons. It's a very strong buff. All right, let me just get involved here. So we'll summon. And you can see the HP of all of my Mausoleum soldiers. And then if I Rally the Legion, they all light up. Okay, so when Rally the Legion is active, all of my soldiers are going to do more damage, they're going to have more defense, and they're going to regenerate HP. You can see their HP bars ticking back up as they stand there. And that is just, I mean, it's just incredible. On the right summons, especially the Great Shield ones, it makes them extremely difficult to kill, even if they're not reinforced very much. Rally the Legion really does cement the summons playstyle, because it makes your summons actually viable almost no matter the reinforcement level, which is incredible. Also, if you consider the fact that you can just resummon over and over again, and then Rally the Legion again, then it really does allow you to rely entirely on your summons if you wanted. I know some challenge runners discuss the possibility sometimes of doing summon-only playthroughs. Well, in Convergence mod, that would be pretty easy. That would not be a tremendous challenge, just based on the way that we've set things up here. So Rally the Legion, really good. Now, a little caveat, if you were to play in Seamless Co-op or in co-op in any way, it will also buff your friends and allies, not just your summons, but also other players. So that's kind of a cool thing, too. To me, that kind of makes Necromancer one of the best co-op classes to pick. Support-style classes, you might say. So I mentioned before that there's a spell that makes the summon debuff not happen, and this is it right here, a Curse Binding. So if I cast this, you see I get a little visual buff on me. And then if I summon, voila, it does not affect my HP and other things. So if I cast it again, I will turn it off. Oh wait, no, it doesn't turn it off. So if I turned it off, let's just say for argument's sake that I were to turn it off. Here we go. And I don't have it on this time, and I'm going to summon. It lowers my HP. But then if I cast it, it's retroactive. It will actually turn it off when it comes on. This is actually one of the latest features that we added to the spell. Initially, you have to have it on first, but we decided that that was a little bit, not unfair, but just not a very clean system. So we changed it so that now when you cast it after the fact, it is retroactive. And so once again, you can have no summon debuff, and you can buff your summons. Just definitely putting a lot of emphasis on this particular type of play. Up next, we have Ancient Death Ranker. So this is a simple upgraded version of Rancor Call. It's essentially the same spell, it just does more damage, and also costs more FP, and has higher requirements, right? Same animation, same basic principle. There you go. Definitely more effective than Rancor Call. Very good spell. Up next we have Sacrifice. Now what Sacrifice does is... Sacrifice. Instantly kill your summoned minions. When they die, you recover resources and gain a buff that increases damage and defense. You receive a buff that increases your absorption and holy damage you deal by 10% for 30 seconds. When your summons die after being sacrificed, you recover all HP, FP, and stamina points. So it's a full resource regen. Now, you have to have a summon active for this to work. It will not do anything if you don't have a summon active. So the idea here is that you can go ahead and let's get our setup going here. So I'm going to get a Curse Binding active. I'm going to summon. I'm going to rally the Legion. I'm going to let them fight for a little while, and I'm just going to run around and sort of get hit by stuff. Out. Ouch. All right. So my summons are in there. They're doing stuff. They're fighting. And you can time this really cleverly with Sacrifice, where your summons might be on the verge of death, or only one of them might be left. And then to see that they're almost dead, I'm going to Sacrifice. Boom! They die, and I get full health. And then I can just simply resummon. This is kind of how we intended for the Necromancer to fight. This style of play. And that this whole time, of course, I could be shooting projectiles at these enemies. This sort of gameplay loop, you might say, of summoning, rallying, sacrificing, and resummoning is just amazingly effective. It is. It's really, really good. An additional feature to Sacrifice is actually that when you cast it, your summons explode and deal a little bit of damage to things nearby. But that was a sort of a late addition to the spell, and is something that we need to update the spell description of it. It used to be a feature of a later spell called Ghost Flame Embrace, and so we just need to shuffle around those descriptions a bit, because now the explosion is a feature of Sacrifice, not Ghost Flame Embrace. Up next we have Curse of Putrefaction. So this spell sends out a curse projectile toward foes, which upon impact curses the enemy. The curse lowers the target's absorption to holy damage by 10% and deals holy damage over time, lasts for 20 seconds. So Curse of Putrefaction is a simple dot, keeping in theme with the idea that they are that you're more an attrition-based fighter. You're not really trying to do a ton of damage up front. But in terms of the strength of this dot, I would say Curse of Putrefaction is relatively strong. The damage it deals is flat, it's not percentage, but it does scale. So you see a sort of common theme here. Like, what we tend to do when we have damage over time is we tend to group it or sort of categorize it by the way in which it deals damage. Like with the Nox Oracle, it's pretty much all percentage based. And then like Godslayer has a short duration percentage based usually. And then the there's several others that are more flat. And there's several that are flat that don't scale. And also the percentage-based ones don't scale. But then this class uses dots that are flat, but they do scale, meaning that your stats matter for the damage. And so that's kind of makes their dots. It makes everyone's dots a little bit unique. Each dot sort of works in a slightly different way. By dot, of course, I mean damage over time. Okay, so up next we have Rancor Bolts. So this is sort of a late addition to their toolkit, or I want to say mid-game addition to their toolkit, which is actually a fast cast spell projectile. A single Rancor shot shoots out. The damage to mana on this is a little weak. The amount of damage it does for the amount of mana it costs is a little bit lopsided and not in a favorable way. The reason why is that we felt that giving them a fast cast projectile spell, while important piece of their toolkit, is kind of stretching outside the bounds of the scope of the class. And so to give them this tool, we felt they needed a little bit of extra downside for having it. And that's not to say this spell is bad. It's certainly not bad. You kind of get to a point where it's so important that I find myself using it like all the time. Like it's hard to overstate how important having a fast cast projectile is for any pure caster. And that's really what it came down to, is that we felt that this class couldn't effectively fight without summons unless they had a spell like this. And we wanted that to be a possibility for Necromancers. So we added the spell. Okay, next batch of spells. We have replaced Explosive Ghost Flame with a new version called Ghost Flame Cannon. And so this works a lot like Cannon of Haima in vanilla. Non-charge does this. Shoots out a little Ghost Flame explosion that flies out in an arc. And then the full charge does the explosive Ghost Flame explosion and puts the pattern on the ground. The spell's quite good, damage-wise. It's quite good range-wise. I mean, Cannon of Haima is good, right? And so because Cannon of Haima is good, this spell is good. It's basically the same thing. A rebranding of Cannon of Haima, you might say. The spell also builds Frostbite pretty exceptionally well, unlike a lot of the other Ghost Flame spells. And it's just fun. Okay, up next we have Wave of Corruption. This is a style of spell that we've been including more and more as we've sort of gotten better at making them. And so, yeah, it creates a big, giant field that expands outward of Deathblight that does damage and also builds Deathblight quite quickly. So I'll cast it here. When you first cast it, it does initialize, when it initializes, it starts out with an explosion. And the idea there is that anything that's particularly close to you, it might help get them away from you, get them off of you. So you can see here that the dot it deals is not fantastic, but it definitely builds Deathblight quick. So it's kind of one of these things that we talked about before with the whole precast concept, where you might want to use something before the battle is really joined, right? You might want to precast this first. And of course, that would be very advantageous because the thing is going to become death blighted, and also they're going to take damage from the Wave of Corruption itself. The downside is that it limits your visibility quite a bit. So you kind of need to know what you're up to before you do that. Next, we actually have the third upgrade of the Ranker spells. This is a new one that we made called Ranker Storm. It's basically the same as Ancient Death Ranker, except more numerous, and therefore doing more damage. Quite a few skulls come out of that thing. Overall damage is greater than the last Ranker spells, but does have more projectiles, so that means you kind of need more things to hit. However, the tracking on the Ranker Storm skulls is slightly better. So, okay, up next we have one of the more interesting spells, Soul Steal, a spell that took quite a while to wrestle it into shape in terms of balance and getting it to work the way that we intend. So, Soul Steal violently rip an enemy soul from their body as a projectile that moves toward the caster. The enemy instantly becomes stunned. When the soul is absorbed, the caster becomes drained of all stamina for a few seconds and loses all remaining FP. And then it has a little additional line down here. If the caster is affected by the Phoenix of Death sorcery, this spell will replenish the Death Ward effect of that spell if Death Ward is not currently active. Okay, so this spell has a tie-in with another later spell, and we will get to that in just a moment. But to see how it works, you cast it, it will instantly stagger anything that you hit, and that, in his case, he was blocking, and so he didn't actually get poise broken, because that is the intent, is that it's supposed to poise break something. So I could take it here and do this, and he's instantly poise broken. However, I have no stamina, which means that I can't run in and give him a riposte unless his stagger animation is exceptionally long. So the idea behind the timing of losing all of your stamina is that it's something like 90% of all enemies in the game will recover before you're able to deliver a riposte. And that's completely by design. Instantly poise breaking something with one spell, anyone would admit, is ridiculously powerful in this game, where poise breaks are so strong. So in order to make a spell that was capable of doing this, we definitely needed to put a lot of checks and balances on it. And so the concept behind the spell is that it gives you a free stagger, which might buy you time. If you're worried that if you were going to drink an Estus, for example, and you were scared that if you drank an Estus, that Melania might stab you in the face, or that Margit might throw a spear at you, or whatever it might be, this gives you a moment to drink your Estus to stay alive. It's sort of a last ditch. I'm in trouble. I need to do something about it. Also, if you're using it with summons, it once again, it buys you time for your summons to recover, for them to draw aggro back again. It's a utility spell, and that's the purpose of it. And it does have an exceptionally powerful effect. And once again, we kind of come back to this idea of co-op, right? If you were to use this and you were playing with someone who had exceptionally good a critical build, then this is the perfect utility spell to sort of create a combo amongst your party, right? So that was another sort of purpose of it. But the real reason it exists, you'll see in just a moment. All right, up next we have Ghost Flame Embrace. Okay, so Ghost Flame Embrace is a buff for your minions. And when you cast it, you can see all my minions get this glowy effect on them. And so now and also I get the glowy effect as well. And that when we get close to stuff, it takes damage. It doesn't take much, mind you, but each one of my summons is capable of dealing this damage. And so it essentially turns all of your summons into a walking dot, a walking damage over time. And it also builds a very small amount of frostbite. So this is just a way to essentially improve the effectiveness of your summons, essentially giving them more damage and building an additional status effect. So it's another supplemental buff, kind of like Rally the Legion, and these two things working together is quite strong, I would say. Obviously, things like Rally the Legion and things like Ghost Flame Embrace are more effective if you're using the summons that have multiple entities, like multiple companions. And those buffs obviously lose a lot of their power level if you only have one, summon that you're bringing out at a time. Okay, up next, Ritual of Ghost Flame. So this is a giant AoE, and it's kind of similar to the Volcanist's spell Inferno, except it's a Ghost Flame version. So we're going to plant the staff and hold it. It's a giant series of Ghost Flame explosions. These style spells are incredibly satisfying, and in certain situations, like against large bosses and what have you, they tend to be really fun. My brain always immediately goes to Placidus Axe when I see spells like this. The fact that it's holy damage and the fact that it builds Frostbite makes it pretty good for a lot of situations on large bosses, assuming you have a big cast window. But I have also found that having big cast windows with summon classes is not difficult because you can just use your summons to draw aggro. Okay, so now we get into the final two spells, the two perma buffs. Godwin's Vengeance and Phoenix of Death. Godwin's Vengeance. This is the melee-oriented permabuff, legendary enchantment. Creates an aura of Deathblight around the player, causing buildup to any nearby enemy. Increases all weapon damage by 10% and all absorption by 20%, but reduces total FP by 75%. The effect never expires. Recast the spell to toggle the effect. Anything near you gets continuous Deathblight buildup. Very strong. Increases your weapon damage and increases all of your absorption, every bit of it. So just you take less damage, things take more damage. But you don't have as much FP, you lose 75% of it. This is kind of a common theme you see amongst melee permabuffs. And this one's sort of unique flavor is the Deathblight aspect of it. Pretty straightforward though. Let's see. Up next, so Phoenix of Death, this is the one that's really has the interesting mechanics. Increases the damage of all death sorcery by 10%. Grants 3 FP regeneration per second, but decreases all absorption by 30%. The thing here is this only increases death sorceries. It does not increase all holy damage. That's an important point. But it also gives you FP regeneration, and 3 per second is quite a bit. That's pretty good regeneration. Casting the sorcery will grant a Death Ward effect to the caster. Death Ward will prevent the caster from dying one time, and then the Death Ward will be consumed. The Soul Steal sorcery will replenish the Death Ward effect if the caster is affected by Phoenix of Death, but the Death Ward is not currently active. Okay, so this is Tears of Denial. If any of you are familiar with previous Souls games, Tears of Denial is an effect that allows you to cheat death one time, essentially. So in this case, but it does lower your defenses, so you are going to take more damage while it's active. But you can tell by the glowing bit in the middle that I am affected by the Death Ward. So I'm going to allow this guy to kill me. Alright, here we go. Should be 1 or 2 more hits here. All right, so there's the death ward, and then it expires. And now I'm not glowing in the middle anymore, but I'm still, it looks like I have Ghost Flame on me. So I'll go ahead and Soul Steal him. And then that has replenished my death ward. So now Soul Steal kind of makes even more sense. It has more utility now, right? It's yes, draining your stamina still sucks, but if that prevents you from dying an entire extra time, then that's pretty much worth it. So you can get into situations, oh, I died again, and then my death ward is gone, and I will Soul Steal again. And so I can keep looping this, assuming I don't die too quickly too often. But it definitely keeps you in a spot where you're bottomed out. You're bottomed out on resources if you're in this loop. So you definitely need to find a way to buy yourself time. Like, you can't run while this is happening, for example, and now you have to run, and look, my resources are bottomed out. So it just gives you a chance to drink and replenish or whatever it is you need to do to survive. It's definitely powerful, but there's definitely also situations where you might die anyway. Big, long-lasting AoE attacks, things like that, that might persist through the duration of your death ward, and so on. But these two mechanics coupled together was one of the more fun things I feel that we made with the spells in the mod so far, was Soul Steal plus Phoenix of Death. So once again, Phoenix of Death is the magic-themed legendary enchantment, and it comes sort of built in with this Tears of Denial effect. And there's all kinds of interesting uses for the Tears of Denial effect in the mod. One of the reasons is that the logic behind it, the way we had to sort of write it, was, you know, done in a modded way rather than an inherent game mechanic. So there's certain rules that they might have programmed in for a Tears of Denial effect that we simply don't have the ability to program in because we're modders. But we did like the mechanic and we wanted to use it, and I think it's fun, and I think it adds a lot of flavor to the class. Let's move on to weapons. So we have not added any Convergence exclusive death weapons, and the biggest reason why is that the vanilla game actually has a ton of death themed weapons. And we felt that there was plenty of other classes that we've made and other stuff that had almost no representation of weapons. So we didn't want to spend time and resources on a class that already had a whole bunch. I mean, you can see from the list here on weapons for Necromancer, there's a lot. There's a lot that are considered death-themed. Death's Poker, Health and Steeple, Mantis Blade, Eclipse, Shodel, Family Head, Sacrificial Axe, Rosis Axe, Death Ritual, Spear, Clinging Bone, and the Ghost Flame Torch. Now, the Ghost Flame Torch, obviously, is the thing I'm carrying here because it is the weapon that increases your spell damage by 10% of death sorceries. The starting staff is actually one that we did make, the Blighted Branch. And it's a cool model. I really like the art that we made for this one. And then the other one is the Prince of Death staff, which is the typical vanilla death staff, right? And so those are the two sort of staffs that matter, and of course the Ghost Flame Torch matters. In terms of armors, there are 3 armor sets for this class. So we have the Fia set, which I'm currently wearing, and for that set we did add gloves and trousers for those. The Royal Remains set, which you get from Incha after you get invaded by Incha in the Round Table Hold. The trigger for the Incha invasion in the mod is different. Rather than it being picking up one of the Halig Tree medallion halves, instead it's actually getting your 3rd Necromancy tome in one of the catacombs. When you pick up the 3rd Necromancy tome from the Black Knife catacombs, that should act as the trigger and will cause the invasion, because we wanted to tether the Incha invasion to the actual Necromancy path, and so that is the new trigger. And then of course the Mausoleum Knight set we added as well in the Halig catacombs. So let's take a look at the armors. So this one is for the Pure Caster. It adds Int and Faith, reduces the cost of sorceries, and increases the damage of death sorcery. Very straightforward, very good for spell casting. The next one is the Royal Remains set. The Royal Remains set increases Int, Faith, and Endurance, and increases all holy damage by 1. So this is your hybrid set, meaning because it's going to increase all holy damage, so that's spells and weapons. Obviously by a lesser amount, but it also gives you some bonus endurance in there. I like this set quite a bit. And then the last one is the Mausoleum Knight set. This is the one with wings on it, I believe. increases Int and Faith by 4, reduces weapon stamina cost, and increases weapon holy damage. So this is your more pure melee style armor for the Necromancer, because it focuses entirely on weapons, either weapon stamina or weapon damage. But it also gives quite a few stats, so they're all three perfectly viable, perfectly good options. So yeah, kind of like what I said before, is that when it comes to progressing through the game with this class, you can really bite off as much as you want, like in terms of difficulty. This is one of the few classes that I would say has a really flexible approach to difficulty. If you are using summons and leveraging them a lot and really focusing on them, then I would say that the you're going after a slightly more relaxed playthrough, and that's totally fine. I sometimes will do that too, because I think it's really fun to sit back and watch your summons just wail on something while you bombard from far away with spells. It's sort of a great moment as a spellcaster when you actually have the time to sit back and shoot spells, because oftentimes in games like these, if you're going pure spellcaster and you don't have summons, then doing that is kind of impossible. And so it's nice to sort of fulfill that role somewhere. And then also you could take it in any direction you want, any of the traditional ways, without summons, do what you like. And so the sort of trade-off in terms of the spell design was that a lot of the spells are focused on that part, and therefore they end up sort of having less tools in just all-out combat that maybe some of the other spellcaster classes might have. But they do have two really cool status effects to leverage. They have a number of different spells, some with some AoE potential. One of their biggest downsides is that most of their spells take a long time to cast, and a lot of their spells don't move very quickly across the screen or across the ground to hit stuff. And so once again, it's leveraging the idea that summons are sort of meant to be there. And so I actually find it fun, like to be a fun challenge to use Necromancer without summons, but still be a pure caster. I think that's fun, especially if you're using the Soul Steel Phoenix of Death synergy, because you can find ways to survive and do clever things. And I think the class is really cool and really fun and relatively dynamic, right? When you have multiple status effects, it definitely gives you a lot more to play with than some other classes have. So yeah, that's pretty much it about the Necromancer. So I hope you guys enjoyed the breakdown, and stay tuned. We're going to have more coming out real soon. I'll catch you guys next time.